Hi, I'm Elena. I'm 28 years old, and my sister once called me the family's most successful mistake, present at every gathering but contributing nothing worth remembering. She said I had mastered the art of being forgettable, that I was like background music no one notices until it stops playing. Then she orchestrated a symphony of humiliation to remind me exactly where I belonged, and when I finally found the courage to turn up the volume, she wished she had left me on mute forever. If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. There's a particular kind of suffocation that comes from being the disappointing daughter, the one who gets introduced with apologies. This is Elena. Well, bless her heart, she means well. That was my existence in the Morrison household, where my sister Victoria wasn't just successful, she was a constellation that made everyone else look like dying stars. At 30, she had already made partner at the most prestigious law firm in Seattle, owned a penthouse that graced magazine covers, and somehow managed to make perfection look effortless even when she was probably hungover from another client celebration. I worked as a librarian at the university. She plays with dusty books all day, Victoria would clarify to anyone who asked, her voice dripping with the kind of pity reserved for children who still believed in fairy tales. I lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a coffee shop where the espresso machine sounded like a dying whale, and I collected vintage books that Victoria called literary hoarding for people who can't afford real art. When people asked what I did for work, Victoria would intercept like a social media filter, smoothing out anything that might make me sound remotely interesting. Elena works with books, she'd say, the same tone she might use to say, Elena cleans public restrooms, or Elena counts pencils for a living. Then she'd add her signature laugh, crystalline and cutting, before redirecting the conversation to her latest courtroom victory or the celebrity client who'd personally thanked her for saving their entire future. The morning everything changed started like any other exercise in professional invisibility. I was cataloging rare manuscripts in the dusty basement of the Sterling Memorial Library, what Victoria lovingly called Elena's Cave of Literary Rejects, when my phone buzzed with a family group chat message. Victoria's name appeared with that particular dread I'd learned to associate with family obligations. Emergency family meeting tonight. 7 p.m. Try not to be late for once, Elena. And please make an effort with your appearance. We're not meeting at a used bookstore. No explanation. No context. Just the casual assumption that I would drop everything and submit to whatever judgment awaited me, delivered with Victoria's trademark blend of authority and condescension. The try not to be late for once was particularly masterful. I was never late, but Victoria had perfected the art of making her convenience my failure. I arrived at my parents' house in Bellevue at exactly 7 p.m., carrying a bottle of wine I'd spent half my weekly grocery budget on, pathetically hoping it might earn me a crumb of approval. The living room was arranged like a tribunal designed by someone with excellent taste in psychological warfare. Victoria commanding the main sofa like a queen holding court, looking like she'd materialized directly from a Vanity Fair photo shoot. Our parents flanking her like loyal courtiers who'd forgotten they had another daughter. I was directed to the single chair across from them, the one that faced the window and caught the harshest late afternoon light, ensuring I'd be squinting and uncomfortable throughout whatever performance they'd orchestrated. Victoria had chosen her seat with the precision of a trial lawyer. She faced away from the light, every angle flattering, every expression perfectly illuminated. Elena, my mother began, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for delivering bad news to simple people, we need to discuss your situation. The pause before situation hung in the air like a bad smell, heavy with the implication that my entire existence was a problem requiring management. Elena, my mother began, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for difficult conversations, we need to discuss your situation. Victoria leaned forward with the predatory grace of someone who'd built a career on dismantling opposition, her perfectly manicured fingers interlaced like she was preparing to deliver a closing argument. It's about the trust fund, Elena. Grandmother Morrison's inheritance. She paused, letting the words settle like dust on old furniture. The money you've been counting on since you clearly can't be counting on anything else. I felt my stomach plummet into territory usually reserved for job rejections and public humiliation. Our grandmother had died 6 months ago, leaving behind a substantial trust that was supposed to be divided equally between Victoria and me when I turned 30. It was the only financial security I'd ever had on the horizon, the only thing that had ever felt like proof I mattered to someone in this family. The family has been discussing your future, Victoria continued, her voice smooth as silk and twice as suffocating, and we've come to some conclusions about what would be best for everyone involved. The emphasis on everyone made it clear that everyone was a very exclusive club that didn't include me. My father shifted in his chair, examining his hands like they held secrets more interesting than his daughter's future. What Victoria means, sweetheart, is that we think it would be prudent if the trust remained consolidated under more experienced management. Experienced management, Victoria echoed, her smile sharp enough to perform surgery. Someone who understands investment strategies, market volatility, fiduciary responsibility. You understand, don't you, Elena? You've never exactly demonstrated financial sophistication. The words landed like perfectly aimed arrows. She was referencing my college fund, the money I'd spent on a poetry workshop in Ireland when I was 22. It had been the only time in my life I'd done something purely for joy, purely for myself, and they'd never let me forget it. In Victoria's retelling, it became evidence of my fundamental inability to make sound decisions, my complete lack of judgment, my essential unsuitability for adult responsibilities. That workshop was different, I said quietly, my voice barely making it across the coffee table. This is my inheritance. Grandmother left it to both of us. Victoria's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal meeting marble floors. Oh, Elena. Sweet, naive Elena. Do you honestly believe grandmother intended for you to squander her life's work on your little hobbies? She said, hobbies the way other people said communicable diseases. She built a legacy, darling. She'd want it preserved, grown, invested with actual intelligence. Not frittered away on whatever whimsical notion strikes your fancy next. My mother reached across the coffee table with the kind of patronizing gentleness usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to confused children. Sweetheart, you'll still benefit from the money. Victoria has graciously agreed to make sure you're comfortable. The word comfortable landed like a small slap, implying that my current life was somehow inadequate, that I needed their charity to achieve even basic livability. Victoria nodded with the magnanimous air of a philanthropist announcing a donation to the tragically unfortunate. Of course I'm not heartless, Elena. You'll receive a monthly allowance. Nothing extravagant, we wouldn't want to encourage poor spending habits, but enough to maintain your current lifestyle. She gestured vaguely around the room as if my lifestyle was something that could be purchased at a discount store and assembled with an instruction manual. An allowance. At 28 years old, with a master's degree and a full-time job, I was being offered an allowance from my own inheritance. Victoria would dole out my grandmother's money to me like I was a financially irresponsible teenager who couldn't be trusted with a credit card. What if I refuse? I asked, the words tasting like rebellion and terror in equal measure. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time, each tick a tiny judgment. Victoria's smile never wavered, but something arctic settled behind her perfectly applied makeup. Refuse? My father's voice carried the bewildered tone of someone who'd been asked to consider an obviously impossible scenario. Elena, sweetheart, you wouldn't want to be unreasonable about this, would you? After everything Victoria has sacrificed for this family's reputation? Her success reflects on all of us. And your struggles, Victoria added with silky precision, unfortunately reflect on us as well. The Morrison name has a certain cachet in this city. In legal circles, in social circles that matter. I'm simply trying to protect all of us from unnecessary embarrassment. The implication was clear as fresh snow. I was the family embarrassment, the weak link in their carefully curated public image. My modest job, my small apartment, my quiet life, all of it was somehow dragging down their reputation, making them look like people who couldn't even manage to produce two successful children. I understand you might need time to process this, Victoria continued, her voice dripping with the kind of patience therapists use with difficult patients. It's a lot to take in, especially for someone who's never had to think about larger financial responsibility. But I'm sure once you've had a chance to really consider the situation, you'll see that this arrangement is best for everyone. Translation: I was too stupid to understand complex financial matters, too irresponsible to be trusted with serious money, and too unimportant for my opinion to actually matter in this decision. I need time to think, I managed to say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else entirely, someone braver than I felt. Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a mask slipping for just a fraction of a second before sliding back into place. Of course, darling. Take all the time you need to come to terms with reality. But remember, her voice dropped to that particular register she used in courtrooms, the one that made opposing counsel forget their own arguments. Family loyalty isn't just a concept, Elena. It's a choice. And choices have consequences. Some of us have been making the right choices for this family for years. Others. She let the sentence hang like a noose, the implication clear. I left without saying goodbye, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get my keys into the car door. As I drove away from the house where I'd grown up, the house where I'd just learned that even my own inheritance wasn't really mine, Victoria's words echoed in my head like a mantra of worthlessness. Sweet, naive Elena. Your little hobbies. Nothing extravagant. Current lifestyle. Each phrase was a precision-guided missile aimed at the parts of myself I was most insecure about. Victoria had spent years cataloging my weaknesses, filing them away like legal briefs, ready to deploy them whenever I showed signs of stepping out of line. And tonight she'd used them all. Oh, so now we're not worth your time unless we pay you? Victoria's eyes filled with tears, the weapon she wielded whenever she sensed she was losing ground. I can't believe I raised such a selfish daughter. The tears were my kryptonite. They always had been. The sight of my mother crying made my chest tighten with guilt so intense it felt like drowning. I set down my coffee cup, hands shaking slightly. I'll call Aunt Maria today, I said quietly. Thank you, Victoria wiped her eyes with theatrical precision. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the sweet little girl who used to draw pictures for Mama. I remembered that little girl. She'd drawn pictures of flowers and hearts and given them to Victoria with such pride, such hope that maybe this time they'd be enough. That maybe this time she'd earned the unconditional love she saw other children receive. That little girl had never learned that love shouldn't have conditions. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. I worked on client projects while fielding texts from Aunt Maria about her specific vision for the auto shop flyers. By lunch, I'd added another unpaid project to my growing list, pushed back 2 paying clients, and missed another call from Jessica about the gallery showcase. That afternoon, as I worked on a logo design for a local restaurant, my laptop started overheating. The fan whirred loudly and the screen flickered ominously. I'd been putting off replacing it for months, using the money instead for household expenses and family obligations. No, 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 I whispered, frantically saving my work as the screen went black. Panic set in. My laptop wasn't just a tool, it was my livelihood. Without it, I couldn't work. Without work, I couldn't pay the bills that my parents depended on me to cover. I spent the next hour on the phone with tech support, learning that the repair would cost $400, money I didn't have. A new laptop would cost at least $800, equally impossible. When I explained the situation to my parents that evening, their response was predictable. Can't you borrow one from a friend? Miguel asked. Maybe this is a sign that you should focus on finding a real job, Victoria added. With benefits and security. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter just got hired at the bank. I don't want to work at a bank, I said, exhaustion creeping into my voice. This is my real job. This is what I'm good at. Something shifted inside me, like a door I hadn't known was locked suddenly swinging open. Can you help me? I'd be honored to. The next morning, I called in sick to work and met Marcus at his downtown office. It was smaller than Victoria's firm, the furniture was secondhand, and the coffee came from a machine that looked older than I was. But Marcus treated me like my questions mattered, like my concerns were valid, like I was a person worthy of respect. The first thing we need to do, he said, spreading papers across his desk, is get copies of all the relevant documents. Your grandmother's will, the trust agreement, any amendments or codicils. Do you know who her attorney was? I didn't, but I knew someone who would. My grandmother's best friend, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. She lives in the same retirement community where grandmother spent her last years. Perfect. Let's start there. Mrs. Whitfield was 86 years old, sharp as a tack, and delighted to have visitors. She lived in a sunny apartment filled with photographs and the scent of lavender tea. When I explained why I was there, her expression grew serious. Oh, my dear, she said, settling into her favorite armchair. Your grandmother would be rolling in her grave if she knew what Victoria was trying to do. You know about it? Victoria came to see me 2 weeks after the funeral. Asked me what I knew about the trust, what your grandmother's intentions were. I told her the truth, that Evelyn Morrison was very specific about wanting both her granddaughters to have equal shares no matter what. She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a manila folder. Your grandmother gave me copies of everything just in case. She said Victoria was ambitious, but that ambition without conscience could be dangerous. She wanted to make sure you had protection. My hands shook as I opened the folder. There it was, in black and white, the Morrison Family Trust, established by Evelyn Morrison, with clear provisions for equal distribution to my beloved granddaughters, Victoria Morrison and Elena Morrison, upon Elena's 30th birthday. But there was more. An amendment dated just 6 months before grandmother's death, with a clause I hadn't expected. Should either beneficiary attempt to coerce, manipulate, or defraud the other out of their rightful inheritance, their share shall be forfeit and transferred entirely to the wronged party. Marcus let out a low whistle when he saw it. Your grandmother was one smart woman. What does this mean? It means Victoria doesn't just lose if she tries to steal your inheritance, she loses everything. Your grandmother was protecting you even from beyond the grave. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the trust documents spread across my kitchen table, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: power. Not the kind of power Victoria wielded, the power to intimidate and control, but the quiet power of truth, of rights that couldn't be taken away by manipulation or family pressure. My phone rang. Victoria. Elena, her voice was syrupy sweet, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I want you to know that I've arranged for you to receive $2,000 a month from the trust. Isn't that generous? $2,000. From a trust worth over $2 million. That's very kind of you, I said quietly. But I won't be needing your generosity. Silence. Then, what do you mean? I mean, I've seen the actual trust documents, Victoria. I know what grandmother really wanted. The silence stretched longer this time. When Victoria spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. You don't know what you're playing with, Elena. I think I'm beginning to understand perfectly. Family loyalty means nothing to you, does it? After everything I've done for this family, everything I've sacrificed. What have you sacrificed, Victoria? Name one thing. I've carried this family's reputation on my shoulders for years while you've hidden in your little library, contributing nothing, embarrassing us with your lack of ambition. Is that what you tell yourself? That you're carrying us? I am. Do you think anyone takes the Morrison name seriously because of you? Do you think our parents are proud because of your contributions? Everything good about this family comes from me. The words hit like they were meant to, designed to make me small again, to make me doubt my worth. But something had changed. I had proof now, not just of my rights but of my grandmother's love, her belief in my worth. You're right about one thing, Victoria. You have been carrying something all these years. But it isn't the family, it's the fear that someday we'd all realize you're not as indispensable as you pretend to be. I hung up before she could respond. The next morning, Marcus filed a formal petition with the probate court, requesting full disclosure of all trust-related documents and transactions. We also sent a certified letter to Victoria's law firm, making it clear that I knew my rights and intended to exercise them. The response came within hours, a call from Victoria's senior partner, Richard Blackwood, requesting a meeting. "This is getting messy," Marcus warned me as we sat in his car outside Blackwood and Associates. "They're going to try to intimidate you. Remember, you have every right to be here, and you have every right to your inheritance." The law firm occupied an entire floor of a downtown skyscraper, all marble and mahogany and windows that looked out over Elliott Bay. Victoria was waiting for us in the conference room, flanked by 3 lawyers in suits that probably cost more than I made in a month. "Elena," Victoria said as we entered, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "I'm so disappointed that you felt the need to involve outsiders in family business." Richard Blackwood gestured for us to sit. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to doubt his own importance. "Ms. Morrison," he said, addressing me with the tone one might use with a confused child, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Your sister has been managing your grandmother's estate with the utmost care and professionalism. Perhaps we can resolve this without unnecessary litigation." Marcus placed a copy of the trust documents on the table. "There's no misunderstanding. Ms. Elena Morrison is entitled to exactly half of the trust assets, as clearly stated in these documents." Blackwood barely glanced at the papers. "These documents require interpretation. Trusts of this complexity often benefit from unified management. Ms. Victoria Morrison has graciously offered to. Ms. Victoria Morrison has graciously offered to steal her sister's inheritance," Marcus interrupted. "And according to this amendment, that attempt could cost her everything." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across Victoria's face. She looked at Blackwood, who was now actually reading the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Where did you get these?" Victoria demanded. "From grandmother's attorney," I said. "The original attorney. The one who actually wrote them." Victoria's laugh was hollow. "Oh, Elena. You always were naive. Do you really think this changes anything? Do you think anyone will believe that you're capable of managing this kind of money? Mother and father will testify that you've never shown any financial responsibility." "Actually," Marcus said, pulling out another folder, "we've done some research into Ms. Elena Morrison's financial history. She's been living entirely within her means for the past 10 years, has never defaulted on any debt, and has been systematically paying off her student loans ahead of schedule. Her credit score is actually higher than yours, Ms. Victoria Morrison." I stared at him. I hadn't known he'd done that research, but hearing it laid out like that, proof that I wasn't the financial disaster Victoria had always painted me as, felt like vindication. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly. "This is ridiculous. The trust should remain unified. It's what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, "is following grandmother's wishes. She wanted us each to have our independence. She wanted us each to have our own choices." "Independence." Victoria's voice rose. "Elena, you've never been independent a day in your life. You've always needed someone to take care of you, to make decisions for you. What are you going to do with $1 million? Buy more old books nobody wants to read." The room fell silent. Even Blackwood looked uncomfortable. "Maybe," I said quietly. "Or maybe I'll finally have the freedom to find out who I am when I'm not constantly being told who I should be." The meeting ended with Blackwood promising to review the documents more thoroughly and get back to us within the week. As we waited for the elevator, Victoria caught up with me. "Elena," she said, her voice low enough that the lawyers couldn't hear, "you're making a mistake. Family is all we have. When this is over, when you've gotten your money and proven your point, you'll still need us. Don't burn bridges you might need to cross again." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life I saw her clearly. Not as the golden child I'd always envied, not as the successful sister who overshadowed me, but as someone desperately afraid of losing control. "Victoria," I said softly, "I never wanted to burn bridges. I just wanted to exist on the same side of the river as the rest of my family." A week later, Marcus called with news. "They're capitulating. Full distribution according to the trust terms. Victoria gets her half, you get yours, no strings attached." I should have felt triumph, but instead I felt something quieter, deeper, relief. Not just about the money, though that was life-changing, but about the proof that I could stand up for myself, that my voice mattered, that I was worth fighting for. The formal transfer took place in a sterile bank conference room. Victoria signed the papers with the mechanical precision of someone who had already moved on to other battles. She didn't look at me, didn't speak to me, treated me with the kind of distant politeness reserved for strangers. As we left the bank, Marcus turned to me. "So what now? Any grand plans for your newfound independence?" I thought about it. For so long I defined myself in relation to Victoria, the other daughter, the lesser sister, the one who tried but never quite succeeded. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the chance to define myself entirely on my own terms. "I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to buy a house. Something small but mine. And I'm going to travel, see some of those places I've only read about in books. And maybe—" I paused, the idea forming as I spoke. "Maybe I'll start a nonprofit. Something for people who love books but can't afford them. Mobile libraries, literacy programs, that kind of thing." Marcus smiled. "Your grandmother would be proud." That evening, I called Mrs. Whitfield to thank her for keeping the documents safe. "Oh, my dear," she said, "I'm so glad everything worked out. Your grandmother always said you had strength you didn't know about yet. She was just waiting for you to find it. I wish she could have seen it." "Who says she can't? Besides, the best way to honor her memory is to live the life she wanted for you, one where you get to choose your own path." 6 months later, I was standing in the main branch of the Seattle Public Library, watching as volunteers loaded books into the first Elena Morrison mobile library van. It was a small thing, really, just one van serving 3 low-income neighborhoods, but it was mine. My vision, my money, my contribution to the world. Victoria hadn't spoken to me since the bank meeting, and our parents had made it clear they considered my betrayal an unfortunate family tragedy. But I discovered something wonderful in their absence. I didn't need their approval to be happy. I didn't need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. As the van pulled away on its first route, I thought about that night 6 months ago when I'd sat on my balcony feeling invisible and powerless. I thought about my grandmother, who had loved me enough to protect me even after she was gone. And I thought about shadows, how they're not the absence of light, but proof that something solid stands in its path. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, saw the article in the Times about the mobile library. "Coffee to celebrate." I smiled and typed back, "I'd love that." Walking out of the library into the Seattle sunshine, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt invisible. Not because I'd suddenly become louder or more assertive, but because I'd finally learned the difference between being unseen and being overlooked. I'd always been here, always been solid, always cast a shadow. I just hadn't been looking in the right light. Victoria had been wrong about one thing: I wasn't a ghost haunting the family portrait. I was just someone who'd finally learned to step out from behind the frame and into the light. And that, I thought as I walked toward my new life, made all the difference in the world. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in October, just as the Seattle rain was beginning its annual reclaiming of the city. I was in my new house, a small craftsman bungalow in the Fremont neighborhood with built-in bookshelves and a garden I was slowly learning to tend, when my mother's name appeared on my phone screen. I almost didn't answer. It had been 8 months since we'd spoken, 8 months since I'd ceased to exist for the Morrison family. But something made me pick up. "Elena?" My mother's voice was different, smaller somehow. "I need to tell you something." Victoria was in the hospital. "A car accident," my mother explained through tears. Not life-threatening, but serious enough. Broken ribs, a concussion, multiple fractures. She'd been working late, driving home in the rain, and had simply lost control on a curve she'd navigated thousands of times before. "She's been asking for you," my mother said. I felt the familiar tug of old patterns, the automatic response to drop everything and rush to Victoria's side. But I'd learned to pause, to think, to choose my responses instead of simply reacting. "What has she been asking?" I said. "Just for you to come. She won't say why." I found Victoria in a private room at Swedish Medical Center, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her left arm was in a cast, her face was bruised, and for the first time in her life she looked vulnerable. She was staring out the window when I entered, and when she turned to see me, her expression was unreadable. "You came," she said. "Mother said you asked for me." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, picking at the edge of her hospital blanket. "I've been thinking about grandmother's amendment," she said finally. "The part about attempting to defraud. I keep wondering if she knew." "Knew what?" "That I would try to take your share. That I would be exactly who she thought I was." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "She wrote that amendment 6 months before she died, Elena." 6 months. What does that tell you?" I sat down in the visitor's chair, studying my sister's face. "That she loved us both enough to protect us from our worst impulses?" "No." Victoria shook her head. "It tells you that she could see who I really was, and she was disappointed." The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. "Victoria, I've been angry for 8 months, she continued. "Angry at you for fighting back, angry at grandmother for the amendment, angry at Marcus for helping you. But lying here with nothing but time to think." She trailed off, then started again. "Do you know what I realized?" I shook my head. "I realized I've been angry at you our entire lives. Not for anything you did, but for anything you might do. For the possibility that you might be better than me at something, might be loved more than me, might matter more than me." She looked directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. "And that's exhausting, Elena." "I'm exhausted." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of knots I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten they were there. "I never wanted to compete with you," I said softly. "I just wanted to be your sister." "I know. I think I've always known that. But I made it a competition anyway, because winning was the only way I knew how to feel valuable." She closed her eyes. "The firm is putting me on administrative leave while I recover. 6 months minimum. They're concerned about my judgment, about the stress affecting my work." "Is it?" "My judgment? Probably. I've been making decisions based on fear for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to make them based on anything else." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain against the window and the distant sounds of the hospital. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "What you're doing with the mobile library, I saw the article in the Times. It's good work, Elena. Important work." "Thank you. I want to help." I looked at her, surprised. "Help how?" "I don't know yet. But I have 6 months to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be better than everyone else. Maybe I could start by trying to be useful instead of just successful." 2 months later, Victoria was released from physical therapy and immediately enrolled in a volunteer coordinator training program with the United Way. She approached it with the same intensity she'd once brought to mergers and acquisitions, but with a different goal: learning how to build people up instead of breaking them down. She didn't expect forgiveness, and I didn't offer it immediately. Trust, I'd learned, was something that had to be rebuilt one small act at a time. But she showed up consistently week after week, asking how she could help with the mobile library program, offering legal advice for the nonprofit paperwork, using her connections to secure book donations from publishers. The day she suggested we apply for a grant to expand to 5 vans serving the entire county, I realized something had fundamentally changed between us. "Why are you doing this?" I asked her as we sat in my living room, surrounded by grant applications and budget spreadsheets. Victoria set down her pen and considered the question seriously. Because for the first time in my life, I'm part of something that matters more than my ego. And because. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I spent 30 years trying to prove I was worth loving, and it never worked. Maybe it's time to try being worth loving instead. The Morrison Mobile Library Project was awarded a $500,000 grant 6 months later. At the celebration party held in the community center where our first van had made its debut stop, I watched Victoria talking with Mrs. Chen, an elderly volunteer who could barely speak English but showed up every week to help load books. Victoria was listening intently, asking questions, taking notes, not because she had to, but because Mrs. Chen's ideas mattered to her. My parents came to the party, awkward and uncertain but present. They'd been slowly adjusting to the new dynamic between Victoria and me, struggling to understand how their daughters had rewritten the family narrative without their permission. "I'm proud of you both," my father said stiffly as the evening wound down. It wasn't much, but it was something. My mother hugged me, tentatively, as if she wasn't sure she still had the right. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry we didn't protect you better." It wasn't enough, might never be enough, but it was a beginning. As the last guests were leaving, Victoria and I found ourselves alone in the community center, surrounded by empty plates and the detritus of celebration. "Elena," Victoria said, stacking chairs with the efficiency of someone who'd spent months learning the value of cleanup work. "I need to tell you something." I waited. I used to think that having a sister meant having a rival, someone who made me less than I could be just by existing. But watching you these past months, seeing what you've built. She paused, then smiled, the first completely genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. I realized I was wrong. Having a sister means having someone who makes you more than you ever thought you could be, just by believing you could be better. 2 years later, the Elena Morrison Mobile Library Project operated 12 vans serving communities across 3 counties. Victoria had taken a permanent position as our Director of Operations, using her legal and business skills to navigate the complexities of nonprofit management. I remained the Program Director, focusing on community outreach and the hands-on work of connecting books with readers. We worked well together, it turned out. Victoria's ambition channeled into building something lasting, my quiet persistence providing the steady foundation that ambitious projects need. We complemented each other instead of competing, created something larger than either of us could have built alone. On a sunny April morning, I was sitting in my garden reading when Victoria called. "Elena, you need to see this," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Check your email." The message was from the American Library Association. The Morrison Mobile Library Project had been selected for their annual Innovation in Community Service Award. The letter praised our groundbreaking model of sister-led collaboration and our demonstration that family can be both personal healing and public service. I called Victoria back, both of us laughing and crying at the same time. "Grandmother would have loved this," Victoria said. "She did love this," I replied. "She loved it enough to make sure it could happen." That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and a folder full of letters from people who'd been touched by the mobile library program. There was one from Miguel, age 8, who'd learned to read with books from our van and had written to thank us in careful block letters. Another from Sarah, a single mother who'd used our computer access to finish her GED and was now enrolled in nursing school. A third from James, a veteran who'd found solace in poetry after years of struggling with PTSD. Each letter was a reminder that visibility wasn't about being seen by everyone, it was about being seen by the people who needed to see you. Impact wasn't about recognition, it was about connection. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dinner tomorrow to celebrate the award? I promise to let you pick the restaurant this time." I smiled and typed back, "It's a date." Marcus and I had been dating for almost a year now, a relationship that had grown slowly from mutual respect into something deeper. He understood my need for independence, my wariness of being overshadowed, and he loved me not despite my quiet nature but because of it. "You have a gift for making people feel heard," he'd told me once. "That's rarer than you think." As the sun set over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I thought about the girl I'd been at 28, afraid to claim her own inheritance, afraid to speak up for herself, afraid to take up space in her own family. She felt like someone I'd known long ago, someone I'd loved but had to let go in order to become who I was meant to be. Victoria had been wrong about many things, but she'd been right about one. I had been like a ghost haunting the family portrait. But ghosts aren't just remnants of the past, they're also reminders of lives that matter, presences that refuse to be completely erased. I hadn't learned to be louder or more assertive, I'd learned to be more solid, more intentional, more present. The shadow sister had discovered she wasn't a shadow at all. She was just someone who'd finally learned to step into her own light. And in that light she could see clearly at last. She had always been worthy of love, of respect, of her own inheritance. She just needed to learn to claim it. The phone call that would change everything came on a Wednesday morning in late fall, almost 3 years after that first family meeting about the trust. I was in the main office of our nonprofit, reviewing applications for our newest initiative, a literacy program for elderly immigrants, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Elena? There's someone here to see you. Says it's about your grandmother." The woman waiting in our small reception area was elderly, probably in her 80s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and intelligent blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She carried herself with the kind of dignity that spoke of a life well lived. "Ms. Morrison? I'm Catherine Walsh. I was your grandmother's attorney." I felt my heart skip. I thought Mr. Henley was grandmother's attorney. Mr. Henley handled the routine matters, yes. But I handled the special arrangements. She smiled, and something about her expression reminded me of my grandmother. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" We settled in my office, and Catherine Walsh opened a slim briefcase, withdrawing a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. "Your grandmother asked me to deliver this to you personally, but only after you had successfully claimed your inheritance and begun to build something meaningful with it." She handed me the envelope. "I believe that time has come." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of my grandmother's stationery and a small brass key. "My dearest Elena," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you found your voice and your strength. I always knew you had both, even when you didn't know it yourself." I had to pause, wiping away tears that blurred the words. Victoria was always my lightning, brilliant, powerful, impossible to ignore. But you, my darling girl, were my steady light, the kind that guides people home safely. The world has plenty of lightning. What it needs more of is steady light. The letter went on to explain that the key opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank, one that contained something she'd been saving for me specifically. "Not an inheritance in the traditional sense," she wrote, "but a legacy that I believe you'll know how to use wisely." At the bank, Catherine Walsh and I were led to a small room where the safety deposit box waited. The key turned smoothly, and inside I found documents, photographs, and another letter. This letter was longer, written in the same careful script, and it told a story I'd never heard before. My great-great-grandmother, Elena Morrison, for whom I'd been named, had been a teacher in rural Montana in the 1890s. She'd used her own money to buy books and supplies for children whose families couldn't afford them, traveling by horseback to reach isolated homesteads and teach children who otherwise would never have learned to read. "She was the first mobile librarian in our family," my grandmother had written. And when she died, she left detailed records of every child she'd taught, every book she'd shared, every life she'd touched. "I saved them for you because I knew that someday, when you were ready, you'd want to know that this work, this calling to bring books and learning to people who need them most, runs in your blood." The box contained dozens of photographs, letters from grateful families, and most remarkably, a leather-bound journal filled with my great-great-grandmother's thoughts on education, service, and the power of stories to transform lives. "The thing about steady light," one entry read, "is that it doesn't need to be the brightest light in the room to make a difference. It just needs to keep burning, especially in the darkest corners where people need it most." I sat in that sterile bank room, surrounded by the legacy of a woman I'd never met but whose life had somehow prefigured my own, and I felt the last piece of myself click into place. I wasn't just Elena Morrison who'd found her voice. I was Elena Morrison carrying forward a tradition of quiet service that stretched back generations. Catherine Walsh watched me read with a knowing smile. Your grandmother was very specific about the timing of this revelation. She said you needed to discover your own strength first, before you could understand that it wasn't really your own at all. It was inherited, passed down through generations of women who understood that real power comes not from domination but from dedication. That evening, I called Victoria to share what I'd learned. She listened in silence as I read portions of our great-great-grandmother's journal, her breathing the only sound on the line. Elena, she said finally, do you realize what this means? That I come from a long line of stubborn women who refused to let geography or poverty or social expectations stop them from doing what they believed was right. That, yes. But also that grandmother didn't just leave you money. She left you proof that the work you're doing matters on a scale you never imagined. She connected you to something bigger than yourself. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the local newspaper and asked to speak with their feature writer about doing a story, not about our nonprofit, but about the Morrison women who'd been quietly changing lives for over a century. The article, when it appeared 3 weeks later, was titled "The Steady Light: For Generations of Morrison Women Illuminate Lives Through Literature." It featured photographs from our great-great-grandmother's collection alongside current images of our mobile library vans. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from all over the Pacific Northwest, from teachers who wanted to partner with us, from other families who'd discovered their own legacies of service, from young women who said the article had inspired them to start their own community projects. But the letter that meant the most came from Victoria. Elena, she wrote, reading about our great-great-grandmother made me realize something I should have understood years ago. I spent so much time trying to be extraordinary that I forgot the value of being necessary. You never forgot that. Even when we tried to make you forget it, you held on to the knowledge that steady, consistent service is the foundation everything else is built on. I'm writing this instead of calling because I want you to have it in writing, something you can keep. I was wrong about almost everything. Wrong about your value, wrong about what success looks like, wrong about what our family legacy should be. You weren't the other daughter, you were the daughter who remembered what we were supposed to be doing in the first place. I hope it's not too late for me to learn from you. 2 weeks after the article appeared, Victoria came to me with a proposal. She'd been researching our great-great-grandmother's routes through Montana and had discovered that many of the communities she'd served were still struggling with literacy and access to educational resources. What if we expanded? Victoria asked, spreading maps across my kitchen table. What if we took the mobile library concept back to where it started? Within 6 months, we'd launched the Western Rural Literacy Initiative, a partnership between our Seattle-based nonprofit and educational organizations throughout Montana, Idaho, and eastern Washington. Victoria relocated to Missoula to oversee the mountain region operations, while I remained in Seattle coordinating the urban programs. We talked every week, sharing stories of the families we served, the challenges we faced, the small victories that kept us going. Our relationship had become something I'd never thought possible, a true partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The night before Victoria left for Montana, we sat in my garden sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars emerge over Seattle. Do you ever wonder what grandmother would think of all this? Victoria asked. I think she'd be proud that we finally figured out how to be sisters instead of rivals. And great-great-grandmother Elena? I considered the question, thinking about the journals I'd been reading, the photographs of children gathered around a makeshift outdoor classroom, the careful records of progress and hope maintained by a young woman who'd understood that education was the greatest gift she could give. I think she'd say we were just getting started. Victoria laughed. Probably. She sounds like she was even more stubborn than you are. Thank you, I said and meant it. 5 years later, the Morrison Family Foundation operated literacy programs in 47 communities across the American West. We'd helped establish 12 permanent library branches in underserved areas, provided technology access to thousands of families, and trained over 200 volunteer literacy coordinators. The Foundation's annual report always included a page of statistics: numbers of books distributed, families served, literacy rates improved. But the numbers I treasured most were the small ones: the single mother who'd written to thank us for the computer access that let her finish her nursing degree, the elderly immigrant who'd learned to read English well enough to help his grandson with homework, the teenager who'd discovered a love of poetry in our mobile library and was now studying literature in college. On a warm September evening, I was working late in the Foundation office when my phone rang. It was Victoria, calling from a community center in rural Idaho where she'd been setting up our newest literacy program. "Elena, you have to hear this," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I'm here with Maria Santos. She's 83 years old and just learned to read last month through our program. She wanted me to call you specifically." I heard the phone being passed, then a new voice, heavily accented but clear with determination. "Miss Elena? This is Maria. I want to tell you something." "I'm listening, Maria." "I want to tell you thank you. Not just for the books, not just for the classes. I want to thank you for not giving up. My granddaughter, she tell me your story, how your family they don't believe in you at first. But you keep going. You keep believing the work is important even when they don't see it." I felt tears building behind my eyes. "Maria, thank you for sharing that with me." "No, miss. I share this because I want you to know, when I was little girl in Mexico, my mama, she always tell me stories. She say stories are magic, they travel everywhere, they live forever. But she never learned to read the stories in books. Now I can read them for her. I can read to my granddaughter. The magic, it keep going." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet office surrounded by the evidence of 5 years of work: file cabinets full of success stories, walls covered with thank you letters and photos from program sites, shelves lined with the books we'd distributed to communities across the region. But what I thought about wasn't the infrastructure we'd built or the recognition we'd received. I thought about Maria Santos, 83 years old and just beginning her journey as a reader. I thought about her granddaughter, who would grow up knowing that learning was never too late, that stories were magic, that steady light could illuminate even the darkest corners. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus: "Home soon. How was your day?" I typed back, "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." Outside the office windows, Seattle was settling into evening, lights beginning to twinkle across the city like earthbound stars. I gathered my things, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind me. Walking to my car, I thought about the girl I'd been 8 years ago, afraid to claim her own inheritance, convinced she was invisible, believing that silence was safety. She seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone I'd known and loved but had to let go of in order to become who I was meant to be. That girl had been wrong about one crucial thing. She'd thought she was a shadow, existing only in relation to brighter lights. But shadows aren't the absence of light, they're proof that something solid stands in the path of illumination. And sometimes, what looks like a shadow is actually steady light, waiting patiently for its turn to guide people home. I drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the coffee shop where I'd once lived in a tiny apartment above the bustle, past the library where this whole journey had begun, toward the house I'd bought with my inheritance, the house where I'd learned to plant gardens and host dinner parties and be the kind of person who took up space unapologetically. At a red light, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Victoria's contact. Instead of calling, I sent her a text. "Maria Santos says stories are magic. I think she's right." Her response came immediately: "The best kind of magic. The kind that spreads." As I pulled into my driveway, I could see Marcus through the kitchen window, probably starting dinner and wondering about my late night at the office. Soon I'd tell him about Maria Santos and her granddaughter, about the magic of stories that travel everywhere and live forever. He'd listen with the kind of attention that made me feel heard, the way I'd learned to listen to the people our program served. But first, I sat in my car for just a moment longer, watching the light spill from my house into the darkness, thinking about inheritance and legacy and the steady accumulation of small acts of service that eventually become something magnificent. Somewhere in Montana, Victoria was probably having a similar moment of reflection, surrounded by mountains instead of city lights but filled with the same quiet satisfaction that comes from work that matters. Somewhere in rural Idaho, Maria Santos was perhaps reading her first book by lamplight, sounding out words that would unlock a lifetime of stories. And somewhere in the future, another woman, maybe someone we taught to read, maybe someone inspired by our example, maybe someone whose name we'd never know, would carry this work forward in ways we couldn't yet imagine. I turned off the car and walked toward my house, toward the light and warmth waiting inside, carrying with me the knowledge that I was no longer the shadow sister. I was Elena Morrison, daughter and granddaughter and great-great-granddaughter of women who understood that the most powerful light isn't the one that burns brightest, but the one that burns longest, steady and sure, guiding people home through the darkness. And that light I knew now would never go out.